The photograph wasn't framed, wasn't cherished, and wasn't even labeled. It was folded into a brittle municipal envelope that smelled faintly of river damp and old glue, the kind of smell paper keeps when it has sat too close to a basement wall for too many summers. A volunteer archivist in Staten Island found it while sorting misfiled Ferry inspection reports, one more loose print among 100 routine stamps and signatures. On the back, in pencil so pale it almost vanished, someone had written, "Balsa, 1931, Pequeno. If you're the kind of person who can't let a quiet thing stay quiet, stay close to this. Like, subscribe, and comment." At first glance, the image seems to support the official story. A crowd on a dock, coats and caps. Faces turned toward the water with the dazed attention of people who have just been told to move along. In the public record, the incident is described in the language of minimization: a minor mishap, a brief delay, a manageable evacuation. The report is tidy in the way bureaucracy likes tragedies: numbers rounded, causes narrowed, blame softened by passive verbs. A ferry took on water. Passengers were assisted. Service resumed. The archivist, her name is Marjorie Dwyer, didn't even know why the photo had been saved. It wasn't attached to a headline article. It wasn't stamped by a newsroom. There was no photographer credit. Just a moment, caught and filed like a receipt. But Marjorie had learned something from years of handling forgotten documents. When a record is too clean, it's often because the mess was swept somewhere else. She scanned the print at a high resolution, mostly out of habit. The dock's ironwork sharpened. The wet grain of the wooden planks came alive. Individual expressions separated from the mass. A man pressing his hat down against wind. A woman holding a child tighter than necessary. A dock worker's jaw set in the strained calm of someone counting heads. It still looked like what the report claimed it was: an inconvenience, a scare, an orderly disembarkation after a small disaster. Then Marjorie zoomed in. It wasn't a ghostly shape or a trick of light or any of the nonsense that makes good campfire stories. It was simply a detail that shouldn't have existed if the official account was honest. On the far right edge of the crowd, almost cropped out, a teenage boy stood with his shoulders tucked inward, as if trying to take up less space in the world. His coat hung on him wrong. Too big in the sleeves, too tight across the collarbone, like a hand-me-down given without time for alterations. And pinned to his chest was a stiff paper tag. The ink, dark against the pale paper, was readable. Not a name in cursive, not a ticket stub, an institutional label. Riverdale Home, it said, with a number beneath it. Marjorie printed the enlarged crop and carried it to a maritime historian she sometimes consulted, a man named Dr. Calvin Pritchard, who specialized in New York Harbor labor and transport. He didn't need long. He didn't even sit down before his face tightened. "That's not a passenger tag," he said. "That's a transfer tag." In the early 1930s, homes like Riverdale, charitable institutions, youth facilities, sometimes little more than warehouses for the unwanted, moved children and teens the way freight was moved, in groups, under supervision, with paperwork that mattered more than faces. A tag like that suggested the boy wasn't simply traveling. He was being sent somewhere, and if he was being sent somewhere, there should have been records, a roster, an escort, a destination, a receiving signature. None of that appeared in the Ferry report Marjorie had pulled. The official document listed the incident's casualties as limited, the kind of word that pretends it's an explanation. It included a count of passengers accounted for, a count of crew uninjured, and a single line about assistance rendered to distressed persons. It did not mention institutional transfers. It did not mention wards of the state. It did not mention Riverdale or any home like it. "Doctor," Pritchard asked the question that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "If he's in that crowd, he said, tapping the boy's tag with one finger. Who was responsible for him that day? And if something went wrong on the water, who would have admitted it? The photograph suddenly wasn't just a scene. It was a ledger with faces instead of columns, a kind of witness statement that didn't know it was testifying. And the most unsettling part wasn't the tag itself. It was the way no one around him seemed to be looking at him. People stared toward the river, toward the ferry, toward whatever had happened out of frame. The boy's eyes were lowered. His hands were empty. No adult's arm was around his shoulders. A small disaster, the envelope had said. Pequeño. But the camera had caught something that small disasters don't usually require. A child marked for transfer, present where he shouldn't have been, and, according to the paperwork, absent from the story entirely. If you feel that tightening in your chest when a record doesn't match a human face, stay with me, leave a like, subscribe, and comment what you think that tag was doing on a dock the day a minor ferry accident was filed and forgotten. Marjorie's scan became a kind of crime scene, not dramatic, just meticulous. She leveled the contrast until the fog over the harbor stopped being romantic and started being information. She zoomed into coat seams, hat brims, the pattern of wet on wool. Dr. Pritchard told her to ignore the faces for a moment and look at what the photograph couldn't help recording. Weather, season, labor. Those collars, he said, tracing the line of a turned-up lapel with the tip of a pencil. That's not an October crowd. That's a cold snap. And see the women's gloves, thick leather, not lace. This is winter, or close enough to it that people dressed like it could kill them. Marjorie pulled harbor weather logs from the same month as the inspection reports. Nothing poetic, just columns of wind direction and temperature, notes about fog and visibility. One entry kept repeating the same ugly word, dense. That mattered because minor mishaps on water often begin as minor until the horizon disappears. The ferry report itself was a single page, typed, signed, filed. It didn't name a vessel, only a route. It didn't name a captain, only crew. It didn't list passengers, only totals. Dr. Pritchard wasn't surprised. Commuter ferries moved too many bodies too quickly for careful manifests. The math was often ticket counts and estimates, cleaned up later to fit a narrative that kept the docks running. So they built their own math. Marjorie enlarged the crowd and began counting heads, not perfectly. Some were half hidden behind shoulders, some blurred into the grain, but even conservative counting produced a number that strained the official total. She marked each face with a tiny dot on a printout, the way detectives circle windows on a building sketch. The more she tried to be fair, the worse it got. The report's passenger estimate looked like it had been chosen first and justified second. Then there was the tag, Riverdale Home, with a number beneath it. Not a surname, not an address, a system. Marjorie searched city directories and charity listings from the era. Riverdale came up in the way place names do, church auxiliaries, women's committees, homes with respectable names and vague missions, but nothing matched neatly enough to declare certainty. A dead end, at least for the moment. Too many institutions used the same language, and too many records had been folded into mergers, scandals, or quiet closures. What they could confirm was the practice. Dr. Pritchard brought out old municipal guidelines and casework notes he'd collected over the years. How wards were transported, how transfers were documented, how responsibility was passed like a paper parcel from one office to another. In that world, the tag was not a convenience. It was accountability. Someone, somewhere, was supposed to sign for the boy at the end, which raised the next problem. The ferry reports section on distressed persons was infuriatingly blank. No names, no ages, no receiving facilities, just the promise that help had been provided, as if help was a substance poured out and not a chain of hands. They widened the search outward into the newspapers. Most coverage was small, one column, a few sentences tucked beneath shipping schedules and city notices. The tone was familiar, reassurance first, facts later. Brief panic. No serious loss. Service uninterrupted. But one local item, barely more than a paragraph, mentioned several persons treated for exposure at a waterfront clinic, unnamed. Treated, discharged, forgotten. Marjorie called the clinic's successor. New building, new signage, same basement archives. A clerk on the phone sounded tired in a way that made her voice honest. Records that old were incomplete. Intake ledgers existed, but not always legible, not always preserved. Still, the clerk agreed to check for a cluster of admissions on the suspected date. Wet clothes, shock, cold water. Meanwhile, Dr. Pritchard focused on the dock worker visible in the photograph, the one with the peacoat and the stance of someone counting. His cap badge was too blurred to read, but his posture told a story. "That man is not watching the river," Pritchard said. "He's watching the crowd. He's looking for someone who hasn't surfaced yet." The more they studied the image, the less it looked like an orderly evacuation. People were bunched too tightly near the gangway, as if herded. Several faces had that distant, careful stare of people instructed to say nothing until spoken to. And the boy with the tag, he was positioned where an escort should have been, but wasn't. If an adult had been responsible for him, the photograph didn't show it. A small accident doesn't need its story polished. This one did, and polishing leaves fingerprints. If you're holding your breath the way Marjorie did, waiting for the paperwork to finally admit what the photograph already knows, leave a like, subscribe, and comment what you think vanished first. The boy's name, or the number they didn't want to count. The clinic ledger didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a photocopy so faint Marjorie had to tilt it under a desk lamp to catch the graphite impressions beneath the ink. The clerk had found the right week. Several entries clustered together, all with the same blunt phrasing: exposure, shock, inhaled water, treated and released. Names were inconsistent. Some were full, some were initials, some were nothing at all, as if the person had only existed long enough to be warmed and sent away. One line stopped Marjorie's eyes. Boy, approx. 14, clothing wet through, brought in with Ferry group. No guardian present. No surname, no address, no note about where he went afterward. Just the age, the damp, and the absence of an adult who could be held responsible. Dr. Pritchard's first reaction wasn't triumph. It was irritation, the kind that comes when a system confirms itself. "That's how people fall between offices," he said, not with a scream, with a blank. They tried to match the date to news coverage, hoping for something louder than a column inch. Most papers kept repeating the official language, polishing it until it slid off the mind. A brief incident, quickly managed, no serious loss. But Marjorie found a small letter to the editor printed days later, an anonymous complaint about children sent across in fog and no proper escort. It was easy to dismiss. Anonymous letters always are. But it rhymed too neatly with the photograph's quietest violence, the boy's tag, pinned like a claim ticket to a coat that didn't fit. So they chased Riverdale. That turned out to be the first real dead end. Riverdale wasn't one place. It was a neighborhood name, a charity label, a respectable word used by institutions that wanted to sound like gardens instead of corridors. Marjorie pulled directories, committee reports, and donation drives, Riverdale this, Riverdale that, until the pages began to blur into the same promises: home for the needy, aid for youth, temporary shelter. One listing seemed promising: a Riverdale home associated with a church auxiliary, the kind of place that might have moved wards in bulk. Marjorie wrote letters, then drove out to the address listed in a 1930 directory. There was no home there now. There was a parking lot and a pharmacy and the thin modern whine of traffic. The church the listing referenced had burned decades earlier. Whatever records might have existed were scattered or pulped or locked behind a legal name change that no one alive could explain. A week of work ended in a curbside silence, wind tugging at paper copies in her hands. It would have been a clean stopping point for a story that wanted to remain small. But the photograph refused to cooperate. Back at her desk, Marjorie stared at the tag again, angry at how much power a rectangle of paper was exerting over her life. She enlarged it further, pushing past the point where grain became its own weather. The words Riverdale Home blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. And along the bottom edge, almost lost in the paper's crease, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faint second line, not handwritten, a stamp. It wasn't mystical. It wasn't a hidden code. It was bureaucracy, the most human kind of cruelty because it always looks reasonable. The stamp read, in broken letters, City, Welfare, and beneath it a partial number, clipped by the pin and the fold. Dr. Pritchard leaned in so close his breath fogged the screen. "That means it wasn't just charity," he said. "That's municipal. That's a department." A department meant a trail, not a perfect one, but a trail you could harass into visibility. Marjorie requested welfare transfer dockets from the municipal archives, ledgers of movements, placements, removals, the shifting of children like inventory between facilities that were never described as cages. The archivist on duty warned her the records were incomplete, that the era was messy, that names were redacted in later decades for privacy. Marjorie nodded and asked anyway. When the docket pages arrived, she didn't search for Riverdale first. She searched for the number. It took hours because the stamp was partial and the clerks of 1931 had written like they were racing death. But then, in one narrow column, she found a match. A transfer code that aligned with the visible digits, logged for a group movement of wards to receiving home north, with an escort name listed only as M. Keane. There was no passenger list attached, no ferry name, no mention of an accident. Just the cold implication that a group of children had been on that route that morning, under someone's care, and that the care was recorded only as a line item. And then came the detail that made Dr. Pritchard go quiet. In the docket margin, next to the transfer code, a clerk had written a note, small, defensive, as if anticipating future questions. Countermanded per incident, wards reassigned as unconfirmed. Unconfirmed, not missing, not dead, not found. A word that keeps a ledger clean. Marjorie looked back at the photograph's crowd and felt for the first time that she was staring at more than faces. She was staring at a number being negotiated. The boy's tag didn't just suggest he was there. It suggested someone later had decided what it would mean to admit he was. If you can't stop thinking about what unconfirmed was protecting, leave a like, subscribe and comment. Tell me whether you think the cover-up began on the water or at the desk where someone chose that word. The name M. Keane was the first time the mystery stopped being a shape and became a person. Marjorie said it out loud in the archive's reading room, quietly, as if the room itself might object, and wrote it down the way you write down a suspect. Dr. Pritchard told her to treat it like doc slang, initials that could be anything, a clerk's shortcut, a person who had learned to keep their full name out of other people's trouble. But the welfare docket had something else beside the name, a payroll stamp, faint but there, a municipal employee code. That meant Keane wasn't a volunteer with a clipboard. Keane was paid by the city, which meant Keane had a file somewhere, even if it was hidden under a different drawer label. It took weeks of polite requests turning into stubborn ones, and then into the kind of persistence that makes bureaucrats decide it's easier to hand you something than to keep refusing. Marjorie eventually got a thin personnel ledger, no photographs, no warmth, just entries and dates. Keene, Margaret, it read. Field escort, child welfare. A start date. A list of reprimands that sounded like weather. Late arrivals. Failure to submit complete rosters. Inadequate supervision during transfer. Inadequate supervision, Dr. Pritchard repeated. That's how they say a child went into the river. The Ferry accident files still refused to admit it. The official casualty number stayed limited, as if loss could be capped by language. But other records didn't care about the Ferry's reputation. The coroner's office had its own logic. Marjorie requested intake summaries for that same week, looking for anything that matched the clinic ledger's nameless boy, approx 14. What came back wasn't a clean match. It was worse. A single-page note about an unidentified juvenile recovered from the harbour days later. Clothing too water-damaged to preserve. Personal effects, none. Disposition, municipal burial. No name, no tag, no mention of Riverdale. And an age listed with a question mark, as if even youth could be negotiable when nobody powerful needed it confirmed. Marjorie sat with the coroner sheet and the photograph on the same table and felt the sickest kind of clarity. A boy had been on that dock with an institutional tag. A boy had been warmed at a clinic with no guardian present. A boy had entered the coroner's records without a name, and somewhere between those points a clerk had written unconfirmed in the welfare margin to keep the Ferry disaster small. Dr. Pritchard called it what it was. A conversion, bodies converted into paperwork that didn't have to add up. They returned to the photograph one last time, not to hunt for new mysteries, but to stop letting the old one hide behind blur. Marjorie enlarged the right edge until the crowd became individual threads of wool and tired paws and wet eyelashes. The boy's tag was still there, pinned to a coat that wasn't his, and now that she knew to look, she saw something else. The dock worker's angle, the way his attention didn't rest on the Ferry at all, but on the people stepping off, counting, recounting. The kind of counting you do when you already know the number is going to be argued. Marjorie wrote a report, not a dramatic narrative, just a chain of documents laid side by side. The scanned photograph, the clinic ledger line, the welfare transfer docket with count amended, the coroner summary. She included the personnel ledger reprimand for inadequate supervision. She didn't accuse anyone of murder. She didn't need to. The cruelty was administrative, and it didn't require intent to devastate. The City Archive's response was slow and careful, the way institutions move when they feel their own reflection in a document. There was no grand press conference, no official apology letter sealed with wax. But something changed in a place where changes are rare. The Ferry accident file was updated with an addendum noting discrepancies in contemporary reporting and possible undercount of affected persons during a municipal welfare transfer. It was a thin sentence, but it cracked the seal that had kept the story small. Marjorie pushed further, because a sentence is not a person. She asked the municipal cemetery for interment logs matching the coroner's date. They found a numbered grave. No name, just coordinates and a city code. On a cold afternoon, Marjorie and Dr. Pritchard stood near that patch of ground while traffic hissed in the distance, and Marjorie read the tag number aloud from the photograph, as if saying it might stitch something back together. They never recovered the boy's full identity with courtroom certainty. The welfare rosters for that transfer were missing, or destroyed, or never properly filed. Another kind of drowning. But the mystery had resolved into something both smaller and more unbearable than conspiracy. A child moved as a unit in a system, lost in an incident the city needed to describe as manageable, and then filed away under words designed to end questions. Unconfirmed. Minor. Limited. The photograph didn't bring him back. It did something else. It made it impossible to pretend he was never there. If you've ever seen a tragedy shrunk by paperwork, like, subscribe and comment what you wish had been written instead.